The dim lights of Nexus Prime's cantina flickered across worn metal tables where alien veterans sat with their drinks. Smoke from exotic substances drifted through the air, mixing with the low hum of conversation in a dozen different languages. This was where the galaxy's old soldiers came to forget their wars, or sometimes to remember them. In the corner booth, Commander Zakthal sat alone with his 4 crystalline arms wrapped around a metal cup. His body was covered in the thick, shell-like skin of the Karathi people, but 20 years of battles had left their mark. Deep scars ran across his chest where human weapons had nearly killed him. His compound eyes, once bright blue like sapphires, had dulled to the color of old glass. The cantina's usual crowd knew to leave the old commander alone. He had been coming here for years, always sitting in the same spot, always drinking the same bitter liquid that reminded him of home. But tonight was different. Tonight, a group of young Karathi soldiers had arrived on shore leave from their first deployment. They were loud and confident, their shells still bright and unmarked by real combat. They wore their military uniforms with pride and spoke in the bold voices of those who had never seen true war. One of them, a recruit named Tokmer, had been staring at Zakthal for the past hour. "Is that really him?" Tokmer whispered to his friends, the Zakthal who fought in the human war. His companions turned to look. They had all heard stories about the legendary commander who had led the Karathi Empire's greatest military campaign. But they had also heard other stories, darker ones, about how that same campaign had ended in failure and disgrace. "Go ask him," urged another young soldier. "Ask him to tell us about the war." Tokmer stood up, his legs shaking slightly as he walked across the cantina. The other conversations grew quieter as aliens throughout the room sensed something important was about to happen. Veterans from other worlds put down their drinks and turned to listen. "Commander Zakthal," Tokmer's voice cracked like a child's. "Sir, we wanted to ask you something." The old commander's eyes slowly lifted from his cup. When he looked at the young soldier, Tokmer felt like he was staring into the depths of space itself. There was something broken in those eyes, something that had seen too much. "What do you want, boy?" Zakthal-esque voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "We wanted to hear about the human war, sir, about what really happened out there." The cantina fell completely silent. Even the bartender, a 6-armed creature from the outer rim, stopped cleaning glasses to listen. Everyone in the galaxy had heard pieces of the story, but nobody knew the whole truth. The Karathi government had classified most of the war records, and the few survivors rarely spoke about their experiences. Zakthal stared at the young soldier for a long moment. Then he gestured to the empty seats around his table. "Sit down, all of you, and order strong drinks. You're going to need them." The young soldiers quickly gathered around the table, their eyes bright with excitement. They expected to hear tales of glorious battles and heroic victories. They had no idea what was coming. "You want to know about humans?" Zakthal began, his voice barely above a whisper. "About why our mighty empire stopped its expansion at the edge of their tiny solar system. About why we call them the Quiet Death." He drained his cup in one gulp, then set it down with a heavy thud. 20 years ago, I was like you, young, confident, certain that the Karathi were the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Our technology was superior. Our tactics were proven. Our empire had conquered 17 star systems without losing a single major battle. The old commander's eyes grew distant, as if he was looking back through time. Then we met the humans. At first, we laughed at them. They were so small, so weak-looking. Their ships were built from mining equipment and cargo haulers. Their weapons were primitive. By our standards, we thought they would surrender the moment they saw our fleet. Zakhthal's forearms began to tremble slightly. We were wrong. We were so terribly, catastrophically wrong. The humans didn't fight like any species we had ever encountered. They didn't follow the rules of civilized warfare. They didn't care about honor or glory or any of the things that make war bearable. He looked directly at Tokmer, who was leaning forward with his mouth open. They fought like creatures who had nothing left to lose. Like beings who would rather die than live under our rule. And when they died, they sang. They sang beautiful, haunting songs that still echo in my nightmares. The young soldiers exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the story they had expected to hear. "Tell us more," Tokmer whispered. Zakthal poured himself another drink with shaking hands. "Very well, but remember, you asked for this. And when I'm done, you'll understand why the Karathi Empire will never again make war on the humans. You'll understand why we pray every night that they continue to show us mercy." The cantina remained silent, waiting for the old commander to continue his tale of the war that had changed everything. Zakthal closed his eyes and let his mind drift back 20 years. In his memory, he could still see himself standing on the bridge of the massive warship Crimson Dominance. Back then, his shell had been bright and unmarked, his compound eyes sharp and confident. He had been Fleet Commander Zakthal, leader of the Karathi Empire's most powerful battle group. The first human ships we saw looked like flying junk. Zakthal told the young soldiers. They had taken old mining vessels and strapped weapons to them. Some were cargo haulers with missile pods welded to their sides. We couldn't believe these creatures thought they could fight us with such primitive ships. The old commander opened his eyes and stared at his drink. My tactical officer, a young warrior named Korvash, actually laughed when he saw them. He said the battle would be over in minutes. We all believed him. Zakthal remembered how the human fleet had approached slowly, their mismatched ships moving in no particular formation. The Karathi had expected them to retreat when they saw the size of the alien armada. Instead, the humans had sent a communication request. The first human face I ever saw belonged to Captain Kim Daeho, Zakthal continued. He was older than most warriors, with gray hair and lines around his eyes. His uniform was simple, not decorated like ours. When his image appeared on our screen, I expected to hear a surrender offer. The young Karathi soldiers leaned closer, hanging on every word. Instead, Captain Kim looked directly at me through the screen and said, "Commander, we cannot surrender. We have families to protect." His voice was calm, like he was discussing the weather, but his eyes held something I had never seen before. "What was it?" Tokmer asked breathlessly. "Acceptance," Zakthal replied. He knew he was going to die. They all knew, but they had decided that some things were worth dying for. The old commanders for arms moved restlessly on the table as he remembered the battle that followed. The Karathi had attacked in perfect formation, their weapons firing in coordinated volleys designed to show the enemy their superior discipline and technology. "We expected the humans to break and run," Zakthal explained. Instead, Captain Kim's ship, the New Soul, accelerated directly toward our flagship. Not to the side, not trying to escape. Straight at us. Zakthal could still hear the sound of the human ship's engines screaming as it approached. The New Soul had been a converted passenger liner, never meant for combat. But Captain Kim had loaded it with explosives and aimed it at the Karathi shield generators. "The impact nearly destroyed our main ship," Zakthal said quietly, but that wasn't the worst part. As the New Soul burned around them, the human crew kept fighting. I watched through our sensors as Captain Kim stayed at his post, his bridge exposed to space, still giving orders to his weapons teams. Another human ship, commanded by Captain Li Huan, had followed the same suicidal tactics. The Mountain Wind was a cargo hauler that Li had turned into a guided missile. As his ship dove toward the Karathi battle line, he had opened a communication channel. Li Huan sang. As he died, Zakthal told his audience. Later, we learned it was a lullaby his mother had sung to him as a child. His voice was clear and strong, even as his ship broke apart around him. The third human vessel, the Iron Crane, was captained by Park Jinwoo, a former factory worker who had volunteered for military service. His ship had been crippled early in the battle, half his crew dead, and his weapon systems failing. Any reasonable commander would have retreated. Park Jinwoo didn't retreat, Zakthal said, with his ship dying around him. He rammed our supply vessel, but before the impact, he did something that haunts me to this day. The old commander paused, his breathing heavy. He opened all communication channels and began to sing. Not alone, but with the voices of his surviving crew. They sang together as they died, their voices joining in perfect harmony. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, and the most terrifying. Zakthal looked around the table at the young soldiers' shocked faces. We had expected screams of pain or pleas for mercy. Instead, we heard songs of defiance. The humans sang about their homes, their families, their hope that others would continue the fight after they were gone. The tactical officer, Korvash, had stood frozen on the bridge, unable to understand what he was witnessing. The Karathi had rules for warfare, honor codes that governed how battles should be fought. The humans ignored all of them. That first battle lasted 6 hours, Zakthal continued. When it ended, we had won. All the human ships were destroyed. But as we looked at the wreckage floating in space, we realized something terrible. He met the eyes of each young soldier in turn. We had won the battle, but we were already losing the war, because the humans had shown us something we didn't understand. They had shown us what it meant to fight without hope of victory, without thought of personal survival, for something bigger than themselves. Zakthal picked up his drink with trembling hands. And we knew that if all humans fought like that, our empire was doomed. The war had been going on for 6 months when the Karathi High Command decided to make an example of humanity. They chose Kepler's Hope, a small mining colony on the edge of human space. The planet had only 50,000 people, mostly families who had come to dig rare metals from the frozen ground. "We thought it would be easy," Zakthal said, his voice growing quieter. "A simple siege. Surround the planet, cut off their supplies, and wait for them to surrender." The High Command believed that breaking one human colony would make the others give up without a fight. General Zakthal had led the siege personally with a fleet of 200 ships. The human colony had no military base, no orbital defenses, just civilian mining equipment and a small security force. The Karathi expected victory within days. The colony administrator was a woman named Choi Minho. Zakthal continued. She had been a teacher before coming to Kepler's Hope with her husband and 2 children. When we demanded surrender, she appeared on our communication screen wearing a simple work uniform, not even a military jacket. The young soldiers listened intently as Zakthal described that first conversation. Administrator Choi had looked tired but determined when she spoke to the Korathi general. She told me that Kepler's Hope would not surrender, Zakthal said, not because they were warriors, but because they were parents. She said they would rather die than let their children grow up as slaves. The siege began with orbital bombardment of the colony's power stations and communication centers. The Korathi used precise strikes, trying to force surrender without destroying the valuable mining equipment. They expected the humans to break. After a few days without heat or light, instead, something impossible happened. The humans adapted. Their chief engineer was a young woman named Nam Yuna, Zakthel explained. She had worked in factories on Earth before joining the colony. Within hours of our attack, she had converted mining lasers into anti-ship weapons. Nam Yuna used the planet's geothermal vents to power her improvised defenses. The mining tunnels became weapons factories where civilian volunteers worked around the clock. Old men who had never held guns learned to operate missile launchers. Teenage children maintained equipment in conditions that would have killed adult Korathi. The planet's surface temperature was 30 degrees below freezing, Zakthal said. Our intelligence reports said humans couldn't survive more than a few hours in those conditions. But we watched them work outside for days at a time, building defenses with their bare hands. The colony's only doctor was Yang Seojin, a woman who had come to Kepler's Hope to escape the crowded hospitals of Earth. When the bombing started, she set up an underground medical center in the mining tunnels. She performed surgery by flashlight, while meteor strikes shook the ground above her. Dr. Yang operated on wounded civilians while our bombs fell around her, Zakthal said. She worked for 18 hours straight, saving lives in conditions that would challenge our best military surgeons. And she was just one person trying to help an entire colony. The humans used the planet's harsh weather as a weapon. When ice storms swept across the surface, human fighters would attack Korathi landing parties under cover of the blinding snow. They knew their planet better than the invaders and used every advantage they could find. Children as young as 10 were part of their defense network, Zakthal continued, his voice filled with something between admiration and horror. They carried messages through the tunnels, maintained equipment, and helped care for the wounded. They never complained, never cried, even when the bombing was at its worst. Food became scarce after the first month of siege. The humans ate tree bark boiled into soup. They caught insects and small animals. They melted ice for water and burned furniture to stay warm. But they never sent a surrender message. On day 60, we intercepted a transmission from Administrator Choi to her government on Earth, Zakthel said. She reported their situation honestly. Half their people were wounded, they had no medicine left, and their food would last maybe another week. The young Korathi soldiers expected to hear that the humans had finally given up. Instead, Choi ended her message by saying that Kepler's Hope would hold out as long as possible. She said they were proud to buy time for other human colonies to prepare their defenses. The siege dragged on for 3 months. The Korathi had expected victory in days, but the human colony continued to resist. Worse, their defiance was inspiring other human worlds to fight harder against Korathi forces. On day 92, sensors detected ships approaching the Kepler system. The Korathi fleet prepared to destroy the human reinforcements, expecting to see military vessels. What we saw instead changed everything, Zakthal said, his hand shaking as he reached for his drink. The human reinforcement fleet wasn't made up of warships, they were civilian vessels, passenger liners, cargo haulers, even pleasure craft, all crammed with volunteers who had never seen combat. The lead ship was commanded by Han Mingyi, a woman who had been flying tourist shuttles before the war. As her converted passenger liner approached the Korathi battle line, she opened all communication channels. "This is Captain Han Mingyi of the civilian vessel Aurora," her voice had echoed across space. "We're coming home to Kepler's Hope. Remember us?" Then the volunteers had begun to sing. 1 year into the war, everything changed. The humans had learned something terrible about their enemies. They discovered that the Korathi were not just warriors, but creatures of tradition and honor. The humans decided to use this knowledge as a weapon. "At first we thought the humans were simply brave but foolish," Zakthal told the young soldiers. "We expected them to learn our ways of fighting and try to copy us. Instead, they did something we never expected. They studied us like scientists studying insects. The humans had captured Korathi prisoners and treated them well, asking questions about their culture and beliefs. They learned that Korathi society valued honor above all else. They discovered that certain sounds and colors had deep meaning to the alien warriors. Then they used this knowledge to break their enemies' minds. The first sign of change came during the Battle of Titan Station," Zakthal continued. "Our forces were approaching the human outpost when something strange happened. Music began playing on all communication channels." The young Korathi looked confused. "Music, sir, not just any music," Zakthal explained. The humans had learned that certain frequencies caused pain to Karathi hearing organs. But instead of using harsh noise, they chose something much more clever. They played lullabies. Communications officer Ruhai Engine had been responsible for the psychological warfare program. He was a small, quiet man who had worked in radio broadcasting before the war. Ru understood that the most effective weapons were not always the loudest ones. The lullabies were sung by human children, Zakthal said, his voice growing softer. Little voices singing gentle songs about sleep and safety in home. But the frequencies were adjusted to cause headaches and confusion in Karathi brains. Our warriors found themselves crying without knowing why. Before each battle, the humans would broadcast different types of music. Sometimes it was funeral songs that made Karathi soldiers think about death. Other times it was celebration music. That filled them with homesickness for their distant world. We tried to block the transmissions, Zakthal explained, but the humans were clever. They hid the music inside normal military communications. By the time we realized what was happening, our troops were already affected. The psychological warfare grew more sophisticated. The humans began sending messages written in perfect Karathi language, using formal honor phrases that showed deep respect for their enemies. The messages spoke of sadness for the war and hope for peace. We thought these were surrender offers, Zakthal said. Our translators confirmed that the grammar was perfect, the honor phrases correctly used. But then we discovered something horrible. The messages had been recorded by human soldiers who were already dead. Men and women like Sergeant Park Duhayan and Lieutenant Kim Theron had spent their final hours learning Karathi language and customs, creating recordings to be sent after their deaths. Imagine receiving a message of peace from someone you had killed days earlier, Zakthal said to the shocked young soldiers. Imagine hearing their voice, speaking your language better than you spoke it yourself, offering forgiveness for their own death. But the worst was yet to come. The humans created special teams they called ghost squads. These were volunteers who would infiltrate Karathi ships to live like parasites in the walls and maintenance tunnels. Staff Sergeant Oh Do-yoon had been a maintenance worker before the war. She was small enough to crawl through air vents and quiet enough to move without being detected. Oh spent 43 days living inside a Karathi battlecruiser, slowly driving the crew insane. She would leave small gifts, Zakthal explained. Origami flowers made from food wrappers. Little drawings of Karathi families. Messages written in our language saying, I forgive you, and your children are beautiful. Corporal Bay Tejo specialized in sabotage, but not the kind that caused explosions. He would adjust temperature controls to make rooms slightly too cold. He would dim lights just enough to cause eye strain. He would play recorded whispers through the ship's communication system at random times. The psychological pressure was unbearable, Zakthal said. Our warriors knew that humans were living in their ships, but they couldn't find them. Every strange sound, every shadow, every mechanical problem became a source of terror. Lieutenant Shin Najin became famous among Karathi crews as the paper flower ghost. She would spend weeks inside enemy ships, leaving origami flowers in impossible places. Crew members would find them on their pillows, in their food, even inside their personal weapons. One of our captains found a paper flower inside his sealed helmet, Zakthal said. He had checked that helmet himself just hours before. The flower contained a note saying, Sleep well, warrior. May your dreams be peaceful. The ghost squads never killed anyone directly. Instead, they focused on making their enemies afraid to sleep, afraid to eat, afraid to be alone. Karathi suicide rates began climbing as warriors broke under the psychological pressure. We started to fear our own ships more than human weapons, Zakthal admitted. Warriors requested transfers to ground combat because at least there you could see your enemy. The humans had discovered something terrible about warfare. They learned that breaking an enemy's spirit was more effective than breaking their bodies. They turned the Karathi sense of honor into a weapon against them. By the end of the second year, Zakthal concluded, our empire was winning every battle but losing the war. Because our warriors could no longer fight. They were too afraid, too broken, too filled with guilt about fighting an enemy that showed them such strange mercy. The final battle never happened. After 3 years of war, the Karathi Empire sent a message to Earth asking for peace talks. But it wasn't because they had lost on the battlefield. The Karathi had won almost every major engagement, destroyed hundreds of human ships, and captured dozens of worlds. We sued for peace because our warriors were broken, Zakthal said quietly. Half of our veteran soldiers had requested medical discharge. The other half could barely function. We were afraid of our own shadows. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral space station called Haven Point. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Lee Kung-suk, a former teacher who had lost her 2 sons in the war. The Karathi expected anger, demands for revenge, or at least hard bargaining for territory. Instead, Ambassador Lee arrived carrying gifts. She brought artwork created by human children, Zakthal explained to his audience. Paintings showing Karathi and human families living together in peace. Music composed by Earth's greatest musicians, written specifically to honor our war dead. The young soldiers looked confused. They honored our dead. Sir, not just honored, Zactol replied. They had learned the names of every Korathi warrior who died in the war, every single one. Ambassador Lee presented us with a memorial book containing their names, their ranks, their home planets, and personal details about their families. The Korathi delegation had been stunned. Human intelligence services had somehow gathered information about soldiers who had died in distant battles, learning about their children, their hobbies, their dreams for the future. Ambassador Lee knew that Commander Korvash loved to paint landscapes. Zacthal continued. She knew that Captain Zorthok had been planning to retire and open a small restaurant. She knew details about our people that we had never shared with anyone. But the most shocking moment came when Admiral Jung Sobian, the human military commander, requested permission to address the Korathi delegation. Jung was a veteran of the entire war, a woman who had seen her fleet destroyed multiple times and rebuilt it with volunteer crews. Admiral Jung stood before us and did something that broke our understanding of warfare, Zacthal said. She apologized. The human admiral had spoken in perfect Korathi, using the most formal and respectful language. She expressed genuine sorrow for every Korathi death, acknowledged the courage of their warriors, and took personal responsibility for the pain the war had caused. She said that killing brave enemies was the greatest tragedy of war. Explained, she said that every Korathi warrior who died fighting for their empire deserved to be remembered as a hero. The humans presented their peace terms, which were shockingly generous. They asked for no territorial concessions, no war payments, no punishment of Korathi leaders. They simply wanted the fighting to stop. Ambassador Lee explained that humanity's only goal was protecting their families. Zacthal said. She said they had never wanted to destroy the Korathi Empire, only to make it understand that humans would never surrender. The most difficult moment came when the humans revealed their final surprise. They had built a memorial garden on Earth dedicated to both human and Korathi war dead. The garden contained plants from both worlds, with individual markers for every soldier who had died. They invited our families to visit this garden, Zacthal said, his voice breaking slightly. They said that loss was loss, regardless of which species felt it. They said Korathi mothers mourned their sons just as deeply as human mothers did. Captain Moonharan, a survivor of the siege of Kepler's Hope, spoke about forgiveness. She had lost her husband and daughter in the fighting, but stood before the Korathi delegation asking for friendship between their species. She said that hatred was a choice. Zacthal continued. She said that her family had died fighting for the right to raise their children in freedom, and that freedom meant nothing if it was built on permanent hatred. The peace treaty was signed in a ceremony that lasted 3 days. Representatives from both species shared meals, exchanged cultural gifts, and participated in memorial services for the dead. The humans insisted that Korathi honor rituals be included alongside human traditions. When it was over, we realized something terrible, Zacthal said. The humans had shown us what we really were. Not noble warriors defending our empire, but bullies who had been stopped by people braver than ourselves. The treaty had been in effect for 20 years now. Trade between the species was common, and some young Korathi even studied at human universities. But the psychological scars remained. The most frightening thing about humans, Zacthal said to the young soldiers, is not their ability to wage war. It's their ability to wage war while keeping their souls intact. They killed us with tears in their eyes and forgave us before we even asked. He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking. We are safe now because they choose to let us be safe. They could destroy our empire tomorrow if they wanted to, but they won't, because they see value in every life, even the lives of their enemies. Zacthal walked toward the cantina exit, then turned back one final time. Remember this lesson, young warriors. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who hates you, but the one who loves you enough to kill you and then mourn your death. Pray that humanity never stops seeing us as worth their mercy. Outside the viewport, a human transport ship passed peacefully through the darkness, its lights twinkling like distant stars.